first time my daughter's husband called me garbage out loud, in front of 200 people, I didn't move a muscle. I'd like to tell you that was strength. It wasn't, not yet. It was just 40 years of practice holding my face still while somebody decided out loud that I was beneath them. It happened at the wedding, of course. Where else does a man like that perform? The reception was at the Wexford Hill Country Club, the kind of place in Connecticut where the valet stand alone costs more than the house I raised my girl in. White hydrangeas everywhere, a 12-piece band, an ice sculpture shaped like the family crest, because that's the sort of thing the Whitlocks believed they had. A crest. My daughter Camille stood up there in a gown that cost more than I used to make in a year, glowing like she'd finally crossed some river she'd been swimming toward her whole life. I want you to picture me at table 19, not table 2, where the parents of the bride usually sit. Table 19, against the back wall by the kitchen doors, between an aunt nobody liked and an empty chair. I'd been seated there on purpose. I knew it the second the hostess walked me past every round table of Whitlock cousins and donors and golf buddies and kept going and going. When her husband, Spencer, that was his name, Spencer Whitlock, stood up for his toast, I folded my hands in my lap. I'd already watched him roll his eyes at me twice that night. I'd already heard him tell a groomsman, not quietly enough that he'd had to invite the cleaning lady. So I braced, but you can't really brace for the thing a cruel man has been saving up. He lifted his champagne, he flashed that orthodontist smile, and he said, "And I want to give a special welcome to my new mother-in-law. She scrubbed strangers' toilets for 30 years so Camille could sit at this table tonight." Honestly, it's a beautiful story. Just folks, do me a favor, keep her away from the silverware, old habits. And the room laughed. I need you to understand it wasn't a polite laugh. It was a real one. His father, Harlan, threw his head back. His mother, Beatrice, pressed her napkin to her lips like she was containing a delightful sneeze. People I had never met in my life turned in their chairs to look at the cleaning lady at table 19 and laughed at me like I was the entertainment they'd paid for. And my daughter, my Camille, the baby I nursed through pneumonia in a one-bedroom apartment with the heat shut off. My daughter smiled, tucked herself a little closer into her husband's side and smiled. That's the part I want you to sit with, not the insult, the smile. I'm telling you all of this because I know some of you are listening to me right now from a kitchen in Ohio, or a truck cab outside Bakersfield, or a porch in the Carolinas where it's already warm. Wherever you are, I'd bet money some of you know exactly what that back wall feels like, the seat they give you when they've decided you don't count. So stay with me, because there was one man in that ballroom who didn't laugh. And the reason he didn't laugh is the reason I'm telling this story at all. He was standing near the bar. Gideon, the family's banker, the man who'd handled the Whitlock Company's money for a decade. He'd come in late, loosened his tie early, and when Spencer delivered his little joke about the silverware, Gideon was lifting a glass to his mouth and he just stopped. The glass hung there in the air. His eyes found me at table 19, and I watched something move across his face that I'd spent 2 years waiting to see. Recognition. Because Gideon had spent the better part of 18 months on the phone with a lender, a quiet, faceless private fund that had bought up the Whitlock Development Group's construction debt when the banks they used to charm started saying no. He'd begged that fund for extensions. He'd flown to a closing where the lender's representative attended by phone, and the signature on the documents was an LLC nobody could trace to a human face. He had no idea who held the rope around his client's neck. And now he was looking at her, the cleaning lady, table 19. I watched him set his glass down very slowly, like it had gotten heavy. I watched the color drain out of him. He didn't say a word. What would he have said? but his eyes asked me the question, and my eyes answered it, and we both knew. The woman, his client's son, had just told a roomful of people to keep away from the silverware, owned the loan that was the only thing holding that family's empire off the rocks. I'll come back to that. Look, first you need to know how a woman like me ends up holding a rope like that. Because if you don't understand the 40 years, the wedding is just a sad story about a mean man. It isn't. It's the night the meter started running. My husband died when Camille was 4, aneurysm, no warning, gone before the ambulance turned onto our street. We had $11,000 in savings and a mortgage we couldn't carry on one income, and I was 29 years old with a child and a high school diploma. People were kind for about 3 weeks. Then the casseroles stopped and the bills didn't. So I went to work. I cleaned houses, yes. That part of Spencer's little speech was true, and I have never once been ashamed of it. I scrubbed kitchens in homes where the women my age were planning Aspen trips, and I learned something in those houses that changed my whole life, though it took me years to understand what I was looking at. I learned that rich people are not smarter than poor people. They just aren't afraid of money. They treat it like a tool instead of a threat. I'd be wiping down a marble island and there'd be a brokerage statement sitting right there, and I started reading them. Mutual funds, rental properties, something called a 1031 exchange. I didn't know the words. I started writing them down on the back of my grocery receipts and looking them up at the library on Saturdays while Camille did her homework next to me. I also kept the books. That was the other half of it. I had a head for numbers, always did, and one of the families I cleaned for owned a couple of small businesses and asked if I'd help with their invoices. Word got around. Within a few years, I was cleaning 4 houses a week and doing the bookkeeping for 9 small companies on the side: a dry cleaner, a landscaping outfit, 2 restaurants, a guy who flipped cars. I saw exactly how money moved through a small business. I saw which ones were really making it and which ones were drowning behind a nice sign. And I saved. God, did I save. We lived like the heat was always 1 month from getting shut off, because for a long time it had been. Camille wore hand-me-downs. We split a rotisserie chicken into 3 dinners. I drove a Corolla with a coat hanger for an antenna until it had 240,000 miles on it. And every spare dollar, every single one, went into the market or into the down payment on a beat-up duplex in a part of town nobody wanted yet. That first duplex is the whole secret if you want it. I bought it for almost nothing, fixed the worst half myself with library books in a borrowed truck, rented both sides, and used the rent to buy the next one, then the next. I never put any of it in my own name. I learned early, watching greedy people circle the families I worked for, that the fastest way to lose money is to let people know you have it. So everything went into LLCs, holding companies with boring names. A woman who cleaned houses and clicked coupons could own 11 properties and a stake in a strip mall, and not one soul in her life would ever guess, and I made sure not one soul did. Here's the thing I need to say plainly, because when I've told pieces of this story before, somebody always asks it, and it's a fair question. People say, if you had all that money, why did you keep living like you were broke? Why didn't you give your daughter a better life with it? 2 reasons, and I'll be honest about both. The first is that the money wasn't sitting in a drawer. It was working. Every dollar was a brick in a wall I was building. And you don't pull bricks out of a wall. You're still building. Real estate isn't cash. It's tied up, leveraged, reinvested. On paper, I was worth a great deal by the time Camille was in high school. In my checking account, I had maybe $600 on a good week, because the rest was buying the next building, paying the next contractor, covering the months a unit sat empty. But the second reason is the one that actually mattered. And it's the one I'm not proud of. I didn't tell my daughter because I was afraid of what it would do to her. I'd watched money rot people from the inside in those big houses. I wanted her to grow up knowing how to work, how to want something and wait for it, how to be the kind of person who could survive if it all went away. I thought if I handed her ease, I'd hand her someone else's weakness. I was wrong about her, but I was wrong in the other direction, and I'll get to that. Camille was sharp and beautiful, and she got out. Scholarship to a good school, marketing job at a firm in Hartford, the whole climb. And somewhere on that climb, she got hungry for a different kind of life than the one I'd given her. I'd hear it in how she talked. Little corrections. Don't tell people you cleaned houses, Mom. Could you not wear that to dinner? She started dating up. And then she met Spencer Whitlock at some charity gala her firm sent her to, and the Whitlocks were exactly the river she'd always wanted to cross. The Whitlocks were Wexford royalty, or they sure acted like it. 3 generations of commercial developers. Harlan, the father, ran the company like a man who'd never once been told no. Beatrice did the social ladder, and Spencer was the prince. Handsome, lazy, and absolutely certain the world owed him its admiration. He'd been handed a vice president title at the family company at 30 for doing essentially nothing. What none of them knew, what Camille didn't even know, was that around the time Spencer started courting my daughter, the Whitlock Development Group was already rotting. I knew because I knew people who knew, and because I'd learned to read a building the way other people read a face. They'd sunk everything into a development on the north end of town, a luxury mixed-use complex they were sure would make them another fortune. They'd over-leveraged to do it. Cost overruns, a soft market, 2 anchor tenants that walked. The local banks that had loved them for 30 years started getting nervous, and a nervous bank is a closing door. So when their main lender wanted out and quietly shopped the loan, a private fund stepped in and bought the note. The whole thing. The construction loan on their crown jewel and a chunk of their operating debt besides. The fund's representatives were polite, professional, and faceless. Harlan was relieved. He told people he'd refinanced on good terms. He bragged about it. He had no idea he'd just signed his company's life over to the woman he'd one day seat at table 19. I didn't buy that debt to destroy them. I want to be clear about that, because I've turned it over in my mind 1,000 times since. When I bought it, my daughter wasn't even engaged yet. It was a good asset at a good price, the kind of opportunity I'd spent 30 years training myself to recognize. The fact that it was the Whitlocks was almost a coincidence. Almost. By the time of the wedding, I held the rope. And I'd decided, in the months leading up to it, that I would never pull it, that I'd be a good mother-in-law, a quiet presence, that I'd keep my secret and let my daughter have her beautiful life. And maybe, eventually, when the time was right, I'd tell her the truth, and we'd laugh about it. Then Spencer stood up and told 200 people to keep me away from the silverware, and my daughter smiled. People ask me, why did you even go to that wedding, if you already knew what they were like? Why sit there and take it? I've thought about that too. I went because she was my daughter, and it was the only wedding she'd ever have, and because some stubborn, foolish, hoping part of me believed that when the moment came, she'd choose me, that she'd stand up, or grab his arm, or shoot him a look, anything. I went to give her the chance to be the person I raised, and I watched her decline it in real time with a smile. And that's the thing that broke something in me that the insult alone never could have. I drove myself home that night. They hadn't arranged a car for me, and I sat in my driveway for a long time with the engine off. I didn't cry. I'd cried myself out years ago over smaller things. What I did was think. Slowly, the way I think about a property I'm deciding whether to buy. And by the time I went inside, I had stopped grieving my daughter and started understanding the Whitlocks as what they now were to me, which was a problem with a solution. I didn't do anything dramatic. That's the part people get wrong about this kind of thing. They imagine some grand explosion. Real power doesn't explode. It just stops doing you favors. For 2 years, my fund had been generous to the Whitlock Development Group. Extensions when they were late, flexibility on the draw schedule, a waiver here and there when they tripped a covenant in their loan agreement, which they did constantly. Because Harlan ran his books the way a child stacks blocks. We had been, quietly, the most patient lender they'd ever had. I stopped being patient. I didn't call the loan, not at first. That would have been loud, and loud was the wrong tool. Instead, I just started enforcing the agreement exactly as written. The contract they'd signed gave the lender approval rights over major draws on the construction loan, the money they needed released in stages to keep paying their contractors on the big North End project. For 2 years, we'd approved those draws in a day. Now they took the full review period the contract allowed. 2 weeks, 3. Every I had to be dotted, every receipt accounted for, all perfectly legal, all perfectly devastating. You'd be amazed how fast a construction site dies when the money slows down by 3 weeks. Contractors don't wait. The framing crew walked when their invoice sat unpaid. The electrical sub put a lien on the building. Word travels on a job site faster than anywhere on earth. And within 2 months, the whole town's contractors knew the Whitlocks were slow to pay, and slow to pay is a death sentence in that business. Harlan blamed the bank, meaning my fund, but he couldn't prove anything because we hadn't done anything wrong. We'd just stopped doing him the favors he'd come to assume were his birthright. He blamed the market. He blamed his project manager, who quit. Spencer, the genius vice president, blamed the economy in a meeting and then went golfing. Meanwhile, I bought their house. Not the development, their home. The Whitlock estate, the one Harlan and Beatrice lived in. The one with the circular drive and the family crest over the door. What the town didn't know was that Harlan had mortgaged it years ago to feed the development. And that mortgage had ended up through a chain of transactions I'd quietly arranged in the same fund that held everything else. When they fell behind on that too, and they did, because all their cash was getting eaten by the dying project, the path to that house ran through me. I bought it through a holding company at a foreclosure auction that, frankly, almost nobody attended because almost nobody knew the proud Whitlocks were that far underwater. They were renting their own home back from an entity they couldn't identify before they even understood they'd lost it. I went to one more family dinner that fall. Camille invited me, out of guilt, I think, or because Beatrice insisted on the appearance of family. The Whitlocks were still performing, still pouring expensive wine, still talking about the development like it was going to make them all rich. Beatrice walked me through the foyer, pointing out the imported tile, telling me how much the house had appreciated. I told her it was lovely. I'd signed the deed 3 days before. I owned the floor she was standing on, the chandelier she was bragging about, the wine cellar Harlan kept disappearing into. I said nothing. I ate my dinner. And across the table, Gideon the banker watched me with the haunted eyes of the only man in the room who understood, and he never said a word either, because he was terrified of me, and he was right to be. It was Spencer's idea to throw the gala. Of course it was. The company was hemorrhaging, the project was stalled, and his solution was to host a $400,000 charity event to remind the city that the Whitlocks were still on top. He wanted the photographs. He wanted to be seen writing a big check. A drowning man does not buy a life raft. He buys a nicer suit to drown in. That gala is where it cracked open in public for the first time. He got up to announce the company's headline donation, $250,000, an absurd figure for a company that couldn't pay its framers, and the room applauded. And then the pledge had to actually clear. The company's accounts were frozen behind unpaid obligations, and the lender review nobody could explain. The check didn't go through. Then a second one for the catering itself bounced in front of the catering manager, who was not a quiet man. You could feel the whole room turn. 400 people who'd spent 30 years admiring the Whitlocks, suddenly doing math. Spencer stood up there with the microphone, insisting it was a banking error, that it would be fixed by morning, sweat coming through his beautiful shirt. Harlan went gray. Beatrice's smile froze into something almost frightening, and my Camille gripped her husband's arm the way you grab a railing on a boat that's listing, and looked, for the first time in years, genuinely afraid. I was there. I'd been invited. I'm still family on paper. I sat near the back in a plain navy dress and watched the laughter from the wedding come back around. Except this time it was aimed at them, low and mean, whispered behind hands. I didn't smile. I want you to know that. I didn't enjoy it the way you might think. I just watched the wall I'd been quietly building come up to meet them, and I felt the strange, hollow calm of a thing finally arriving on schedule. Camille came to see me a week later, showed up at my door. My same small house I never did move, with the polish gone out of her. She sat at my kitchen table, the one she'd done her homework at, and she asked me questions she didn't know she was asking the right person. Why was the bank doing this to Spencer's family? Why were the payments stuck? Why couldn't anyone find out who the lender even was? She was scared, and she was talking to me like I was just her mother, just a safe place, which I had been for 30 years, and apparently could be again the second she needed something. I made her tea. I let her talk. And when she was done, I didn't tell her the truth, because she wasn't ready for it, and because some part of me wasn't ready to give it to her. Instead, I told her something truer than the facts. I said, honey, sometimes the thing that looks the strongest is the most hollow, and the people who laugh the loudest are usually the ones with the most to lose. She looked at me funny. I think for 1 second something flickered behind her eyes, a memory of a back wall, a smile she gave that she shouldn't have. But she wasn't there yet. She kissed my cheek, and she left, and she went back to him. It was Gideon who finally broke. Of course it was. He'd been carrying it for 2 years, and a man can only watch a family insult their own executioner for so long before the pressure cracks him open. I wasn't there. I heard it secondhand, the way you hear these things, from a cousin who couldn't keep it in. It was at a dinner, another one, with Harlan ranting about sabotage and disloyal banks, and Spencer, useless Spencer, accusing Gideon to his face of not doing his job, of being too old, of letting the family down, and Gideon, who'd spent 2 years drinking too much and sleeping too little, holding a secret that wasn't his to keep, finally set down his glass too hard and said it. He told them the company wasn't theirs, hadn't been for 2 years, that a private lender held the note on the development, the operating line, and he could barely get it out, the house they were sitting in, that the lender wasn't a faceless fund at all, that he'd figured it out at the wedding and prayed every day since that he was wrong. And then he said my name. He told them the cleaning lady owned them. I'm told Harlan stood up so fast his chair went over backward. I'm told Beatrice said it wasn't possible. It wasn't possible, over and over like a prayer. I'm told Spencer laughed, actually laughed, and called it the most pathetic lie he'd ever heard, right up until he saw his own father's face and understood that Gideon, who had no reason on earth to invent such a thing, was not lying. And Camille, I'm told, went very, very quiet, because she'd sat at my kitchen table a week before, because she'd asked me why, and I'd looked her in the eye and told her about hollow things, and she finally understood what she'd been looking at her whole life and never once seen. She came to me again, alone this time, no Spencer. She'd been crying for what looked like days. She sat at my table, and she didn't ask questions. She begged. "Mom," she said, "please, You've made your point. He's losing everything. His parents are losing everything. I'm losing everything. Isn't that enough? Can't you just stop? And I'll tell you what I felt, sitting across from my own child asking me for mercy. I felt the whole 40 years at once. The heat shut off. The coat hanger antenna. The casseroles that stopped coming. The chicken split 3 ways. The back wall at her wedding. The smile. I'm not doing anything to him, I said, and it was true. I stopped helping him. That's all. Everything happening to that family is the weight of what they built, finally coming down. I just stopped holding it up. She said, but you could hold it up. You have the power to fix this. I do, I told her. And I won't, because mercy you give to people who never learned anything isn't mercy. It's just more rope. She cried harder then. And here's where I'm different from a lot of the stories you hear. The ones where the woman gets her revenge and walks off into a sunset of cold satisfaction. I didn't want that. I didn't raise her for 40 years to throw her away over the worst thing she ever did. So I told her the truth, the part that mattered. I'm not going to save Spencer, I said. Spencer is going to fall and his family is going to fall with him, and that was decided by them, not by me, a long time ago. But you have a choice. You can go down with that man and his name and his pride, and drown clinging to a life that was never really yours, or you can come back here, to this table as my daughter. Not as a Whitlock, as yourself, humbled with nothing, willing to start over and learn what you somehow never learned from me. That door is open. It's the only one I'm holding open. But you have to walk through it on your own 2 feet, and you have to walk away from him to do it. I didn't make it easy for her. I didn't offer to set her up, to buy her a condo, to make the choice painless. I made her choose between the man who'd called her mother trash and the mother that man had called trash, with no soft landing on either side, because that was the only choice that would actually mean anything. The anniversary dinner, their first wedding anniversary, was supposed to be the Whitlocks' comeback. Harlan's idea, a show of strength, a room full of the people who used to fear them, all gathered to prove the family was still standing. They didn't know I'd asked Camille to make sure I was invited. They thought I was coming as the embarrassing relative they had to tolerate. They had no idea I was coming to end it. I wore the navy dress again. I sat quietly through Harlan's speech about resilience and the Whitlock legacy, through Beatrice's brittle toast, through Spencer pretending nothing was wrong, all of it ringing hollow because half the room already knew the truth, and the other half could smell it. And when the last toast ended and the room went still, I stood up. My turn, I said. I'm not a loud woman. I never raised my voice. I just told them. I said that the development they kept toasting wasn't theirs. The company wasn't theirs. The house they'd hosted dinners in. The house some of these very guests had admired. That wasn't theirs either. That every piece of the empire they built their pride on had quietly passed into the hands of a single lender. And then I looked at Spencer, who had gone the color of the tablecloth, and I reminded him gently of his toast a year ago. The cleaning lady, the silverware, old habits. You all laughed, I said. Every one of you. So let me say it slowly, so there's no confusion. The cleaning lady you were so careful to keep away from the silverware owns everything in this room that you've spent the night bragging about. The company, the contracts, the house, the note your father can't pay. All of it answers to me. It has for 2 years. You toasted me as a joke. I was your landlord. Nobody laughed that time. Harlan tried to stand and his legs didn't hold him. Beatrice put her hand over her mouth. And Spencer, proud, lazy, vicious Spencer, opened his mouth to call it a lie one more time and found he didn't have it in him, because he could see in every face around that table that it was true and that everyone now knew it. I sat back down. I finished my water. And then I did the thing I'd planned all along. The thing that's the whole reason I'm telling you this, instead of just sitting on a pile of money in silence. I looked at my daughter, who was sitting beside her husband with tears already running down her face, and I held out my hand. Just held it out across that ruined table in front of all of them. An offer. The door. And Camille looked at Spencer, and she looked at me. And for the first time in years, she got up out of the chair her ambition had bought her, walked the length of that table past every shocked Whitlock face, and took my hand. She left him sitting there. She chose, out loud, in front of everyone, the way she should have chosen a year before. It cost her everything she thought she wanted. I watched her pay it, and I watched her become my daughter again in the paying. We walked out of that house, my house technically, though I never told the guests that part, and I drove her home in a perfectly ordinary car, and neither of us said much. There wasn't much to say that hadn't been said with a hand held across a table. The Whitlocks lost it all over the following year, the slow public way these things go. The development went to another developer for pennies. Harlan and Beatrice moved to a condo 2 towns over where nobody knew them. Spencer, last I heard, was. The night I held my hand out across that table, I wasn't testing my daughter. I already knew what she'd do. I knew because 30 years of choices, mine and hers, had been quietly stacking toward that one moment, and you can't fake the weight of what you've built. Spencer fell because he never learned that the things holding him up were borrowed. Harlan and Beatrice fell because pride told them the rules bent for people with their last name. And Camille came back to me because somewhere under all that silk, the girl I raised at a kitchen table was still in there, just waiting for it to cost her something real to find her way home. None of it was luck. That's the thing I want you to hear. The cruel toast at the wedding wasn't bad fortune that happened to me. It was a seed, and seeds grow into exactly what they are. Every favor I stopped doing, every draw I let sit the full 2 weeks the contract allowed, was just letting their own choices ripen on schedule. I never raised my voice. I never broke a single rule. I just stopped catching people who'd spent years deciding they were too good to fall. If you take anything from an old woman, take these 3 things, because they're the only things I ever really owned. The first is your character. The quiet refusal to become cruel just because cruelty was done to you. I could have crushed that family the morning after the wedding. I waited, not because I was weak, but because revenge done out of rage owns you, and I wanted to own myself. The second is your mind. I taught myself markets on the backs of grocery receipts at a library table while my daughter did her homework. Nobody handed me that. You can learn the rules of money the same way you learn anything, one Saturday at a time. And the day you understand them is the day people stop being able to seat you at the back wall. And the third is the part that gets you through the years between the planting and the harvest, your grit, the willingness to split a chicken 3 ways and save the difference, to stay quiet while they laugh, to keep building a wall 1 brick at a time when nobody believes there's a wall at all. I don't tell this story to teach you how to ruin someone. I tell it so you'll stop wasting your one life proving yourself to people who already decided you don't count. Let them laugh. Save your money, keep your own counsel. Raise your children to know the difference between a life that's real and one that's rented. Because the day always comes when the proud reach for the thing that's been holding them up, and they find your hand on the other end of the rope. You won't have to say a word. They'll already know, and so, finally, will you.